A millionaire stranded on the roadside with his prized Mustang, furious, frustrated, and out of options. Then, from a dusty neighborhood nearby, a little black girl walks up, barefoot, calm, and holding a wrench like she was born with it. She fixes the car without hesitation. But when he thanks her and reaches out to shake her hand, he freezes. On her tiny fingers are rings that belonged to someone he lost long ago, someone he never thought he'd see again. The sun blazed over the winding back roads on the outskirts of the city, casting heat waves over the cracked pavement. It wasn't a route most people with wealth and reputation would take, but for him, it was supposed to be a shortcut, a direct path to the high-profile car showcase where his prized Mustang, a meticulously restored 1967 model, was expected to be the star. It wasn't just a vehicle to him. It was legacy, power, prestige, a symbol of how far he had come from the days when he had nothing. Everything about his life had been measured and calibrated like that Mustang, polished, tuned, and controlled. He had built a multi-million-dollar empire from the ground up, turning a modest garage startup into a luxury automotive conglomerate. He was known for being sharp, demanding, and cold. Emotions were distractions. Compassion was a liability. Efficiency ruled every part of his life, from his custom-tailored suits to the high-octane engines under his car's hoods. But today, efficiency failed him. Without warning, the engine sputtered, choked, and died. The hum that once purred like a lion now whimpered into silence. He pulled over, furious, jaw tight as he stepped out into the heat. The Mustang was supposed to be flawless. Every part had been custom ordered. The fact that it had betrayed him now, on this road, in this neighborhood, felt like a personal insult. He popped the hood and examined the engine, but nothing obvious stood out. The air was thick and unmoving. Beads of sweat began rolling down his temples. He checked his phone, barely one bar. No signal strong enough to call his assistant or the emergency team. He kept on standby. He was alone, stranded in a part of town he had always driven past but never stopped in. A place he knew only by reputation. Run-down houses, struggling families, and kids who grew up too fast. Cars passed by without stopping. Locals eyed him with casual curiosity. A suited man standing beside an old muscle car, looking increasingly out of place. He was used to people recognizing him, on magazine covers, at galas, in elite gatherings, but here, no one cared. Here, his status meant nothing. He was just another man with a broken car. Minutes dragged on. His frustration grew. He wasn't the type to ask for help, especially not here. He fiddled with his tools, grumbled at the engine, and tried to diagnose the issue with what little he could access. Still, the Mustang refused to cooperate. Sweat soaked through his shirt. Dust clung to his polished shoes. His patience thinned, and with it his composure. Then, from a few houses down, someone began walking toward him. He didn't notice at first. He was too busy pacing beside the car, mumbling about timing chains and vapor locks. It was only when the footsteps stopped just a few feet from him that he looked up and saw her. She was small, maybe 9 or 10, barefoot, hair tied in uneven puffs, a smudge of grease on her cheek. Her shirt was faded, and her shorts looked like they'd been stitched more than once. But what struck him most wasn't her appearance. It was the way she looked at the car, not with confusion or awe, but with familiarity. She stared at the engine like it was a puzzle she'd solved before. Not scared, not impressed, just interested. He was too stunned to respond right away. Before he could ask what she wanted, she moved closer to the car, eyes scanning the open hood. Her small hands pointed to something near the carburetor. She didn't say much. He wasn't even sure she had spoken at all, but something in her gesture, something in her quiet confidence, suggested she knew what she was looking at. And then it hit him. This wasn't the first time she had worked on a car. She looked like a child who had spent time under hoods, surrounded by tools and motor oil, in some small backyard garage. It was such an odd contradiction. Her youth paired with an old mechanic's calmness. She shouldn't have belonged in this world of gears and engines, and yet she fit. He didn't trust easily, especially not strangers. But there was something about her he couldn't ignore. Something that unsettled him more than the broken-down Mustang. She reminded him of someone, though he couldn't place who. Her presence made him feel unbalanced, like he had stepped into a version of reality where everything familiar was suddenly out of reach. Still, he stepped aside, let her take a look. Something about the way she moved, with such certainty and quiet resolve, made him pause his pride just long enough to allow it. As she leaned in and gently adjusted a loose connection, he noticed her hands, tiny fingers calloused in places they shouldn't be for a child her age. And on those fingers were rings, 3 of them, mismatched, slightly tarnished, clearly not for decoration. His eyes narrowed. One of them looked familiar, uncomfortably familiar. He shook it off, telling himself it was coincidence. But as the engine coughed back to life under her touch, the question returned with force. Who was this girl? And what was she doing with that ring? He didn't know it yet, but his life was no longer running on the tracks he had built so carefully. The breakdown wasn't just mechanical. It was the start of a journey he never planned to take, one that would change everything he thought he knew about family, loss, and fate. The car purred back to life, humming with a smooth rhythm of a machine momentarily reborn. The sound should have brought him relief, even satisfaction, but his eyes weren't on the engine anymore. They were fixed on the girl. She didn't wait for applause or even acknowledgement. She simply wiped her hands on her shirt, casually, as if fixing a vintage car on the side of the road was no different from tying her shoelaces. There was no pride in her expression, no smugness, just a quiet certainty, the kind that belonged to someone who had done it before more times than she could count. He watched her more closely now, not just as a child who had helped him, but as a mystery that didn't fit within the logic of his world. She was too young to carry that kind of knowledge, too small to hold that kind of composure, too poor, clearly, to have ever formally learned the mechanical intricacies of a Mustang. And yet she had known. Somehow, she had known exactly what to do, and had done it without hesitation. Questions rose in his mind. Where had she learned that? Who had taught her? Where did she live? And how had she ended up out here, alone apparently, but full of skills grown men didn't always master? He asked, and she answered simply. Her father, once a mechanic before his untimely death, had spent his days under the hood of cars and his evenings teaching her everything he knew. She had learned not just through words, but through watching, mimicking, failing, and trying again. To her, understanding engines was like learning a language. It had been her way of staying close to him after he was gone. Her story didn't carry drama or pity. She spoke of it with matter-of-fact realism. It was her life, and she had accepted it without bitterness. But he heard what she didn't say, too. The long afternoons spent in silence after her father passed, the hours spent digging through old tools and broken parts just to feel useful, the burden of helping her mother make ends meet in whatever way she could. The streets they lived on weren't paved with opportunity, and yet this girl had found her own way to become something extraordinary in the margins. And then came the rings. As she gestured during her explanation, sunlight glinted off the worn metal on her fingers. That's when he noticed them clearly for the first time. 3 rings, each different from the other. One was a silver band with faded engraving, barely legible. Another had a small blue stone, dull with time, but the third stopped him cold. It was an intricate gold ring with a very specific, unmistakable design. 2 vines wrapping around each other, forming a delicate knot at the top, a custom design, a one-of-a-kind ring. He recognized it instantly. Years ago, he had given that exact ring to his younger sister as a gift. It was meant to symbolize strength and connection, a gesture of protection from an older brother who had once promised to always be there. It had been her favorite. She never took it off, until the day she disappeared. He hadn't seen her since. He swallowed hard, feeling a strange sense of displacement. The past he had buried so neatly behind years of corporate success, private grief, and relentless ambition was suddenly cracking open in front of him. His sister had vanished from their lives under painful, unresolved circumstances. The details had been murky, an argument, a fallout, followed by silence. She had left behind nothing but questions, and the guilt of that silence had been folded away in the corners of his mind where he refused to look. Now, the ring he once placed on her finger was sitting on the tiny hand of a stranger. It couldn't be coincidence. It was too specific, too personal. He searched the girl's face again, looking deeper this time, not for familiarity, but for resemblance, in the way her brows arched, the shape of her chin, even the soft determination in her eyes. There were echoes of someone he had once known, someone he had loved. The more he looked, the more the resemblance grew stronger in his mind. He began to ask more questions, this time about her mother. The girl mentioned her name, casually, like it meant nothing to him. But it hit him like a blow. The name he hadn't heard in over a decade. The name of the sister he believed he had lost forever. Doubt warred with possibility. Could it really be? Could this child, this little mechanic who had wandered out of nowhere to fix his broken car, be his niece? Could his sister still be alive? Hidden away in a place he'd never thought to look? He felt the weight of the years pressing on him. The pride that had kept him from searching, the bitterness that had prevented reconciliation, the success that had masked the absence of something deeply human in his life. And now, standing before him, was not only a living connection to that loss, but a reminder of how fragile legacy truly was. He had spent his life collecting things, cars, accolades, real estate, respect, but none of them had ever brought him this kind of tremor. A moment of clarity, raw and unfiltered, brought to him by a girl who had no idea what she had just uncovered. He wasn't just looking at a child who could fix cars. He was looking at a key to a past he had locked away. And now, for the first time in a long while, he wasn't sure if he was ready for what came next. The weight of discovery settled on him with a heaviness that refused to lift. The more he studied her, the clearer it became that this wasn't just a coincidence. The ring had been beginning, a spark of memory, but now everything aligned. The girl's face, her name, the story about her mother, even the way she carried herself with a quiet defiance, all pointed to one impossible truth. She wasn't just any girl. She was family, the daughter of the sister he had lost in a storm of silence and pride. Memories rushed back, uninvited, the bitter fight, the way she stormed out, angry and defiant, unwilling to accept his judgment or the path he insisted she follow. He had been harsh, unwilling to compromise, too convinced that his success gave him the authority to dictate the future. She had wanted freedom. He had demanded structure. And in that collision of wills, a decade had vanished. She had disappeared without a trace, and he had buried the pain beneath his ambition, convincing himself that if she needed him, she would return. She never had, but now, her daughter had, unknowingly, unintentionally. She had wandered back into the very life her mother had once walked away from, and she brought with her a message he hadn't expected. Forgiveness. It wasn't spoken, but it radiated from her existence. Despite the hardship, the girl was strong. She had inherited resilience, curiosity, and a sense of duty far beyond her years. She had grown in the shadow of absence, but had made something beautiful out of it. Her knowledge, her bravery, her compassion. Those were legacies passed down through love, not wealth, and he couldn't help but realize how much he had missed. He had measured his success in profits and power, convinced those things would protect him from regret. But standing on that dusty roadside with restored engine humming, and a child unknowingly holding his past in her hands, all of it rang hollow. What had he gained if he had lost his sister in the process? What good was building an empire when the most valuable parts of life, family, connection, forgiveness, had been left behind? The child didn't know who he was. Not really. To her, he was a man with a broken car and a surprised expression. She hadn't come looking for answers or favors. She hadn't asked for anything in return. That fact alone humbled him more than anything he'd experienced in boardrooms or luxury galas. She had helped out of instinct, not expectation. And that struck him at the core, because he remembered a time when he used to be that way, before success hardened him, before loss turned him inward, before pride became a wall between him and the people he loved. Now he was left with a choice. He could walk away, leave the encounter where it stood, let her return to the quiet streets she called home, to a life of scraping by and unspoken memories. He could pretend this was just a moment, a strange intersection of fate and coincidence. Or he could step forward. He could ask the questions he had been too afraid to voice for years. He could search for the sister he had once let go. He could offer support, not out of guilt, but out of recognition. That family, even when fractured, still holds threads that can be rewoven. He could open a door that had remained shut for far too long. And maybe, just maybe, he could be something to this girl beyond a stranger with a fancy car. Maybe he could be the uncle she never knew she had. Someone who didn't just offer a ride or a reward, but a promise that she was not alone, that her story mattered, that her mother's memory hadn't been erased or forgotten, but deeply missed. But even that step wouldn't be simple. It would require vulnerability, something he had trained himself to avoid. It would mean admitting that he had been wrong, not just in the past, but in how he had shaped his entire worldview. Success didn't come from control. Legacy didn't come from trophies. Meaning came from connection. In that quiet realization, he saw the road ahead more clearly than any GPS or mapped business plan could offer. It wasn't just about finding his sister. It was about healing, about mending the invisible fractures that had defined his family for far too long, about rediscovering the version of himself that still believed in people, in second chances, in building something real. And at the center of it all was a little girl with grease on her hands and rings that carried history on her fingers. She had brought a broken machine back to life. Now, she had done the same for a man, not with tools or wrenches, but with presence, with courage, with innocence wrapped in quiet strength. The unspoken truth was undeniable now. His life had been interrupted by something far more powerful than failure. It had been touched by a purpose. The road forward was no longer defined by polished success or corporate ambition, but by the quiet courage to rebuild something far more fragile. Family. For the first time in years, the man began to feel the pulse of a different kind of well stirring inside him, one that had nothing to do with numbers in a bank account and everything to do with human connection. The little girl had reminded him, not through words but through her actions, that even the most fractured lives could still carry light. That even after years of silence and estrangement, bonds could still be repaired, one small act at a time. He had returned to his home with more than just a repaired Mustang. He had returned carrying questions, feelings he had locked away, and a growing certainty that he could no longer ignore what fate had placed in front of him. He began searching for his sister, not out of obligation, but because the ache of absence had grown too large to suppress. He tapped into old contacts, searched public records, and followed any lead that might bring her into view again. And slowly, almost hesitantly, the path began to clear. Whispers of her name appeared in corners he had never thought to look. Community centers, social programs, records buried deep beneath bureaucratic layers. When he finally found her, it wasn't with anger or blame. It was with humility. The years had changed her, but her spirit remained intact. She had made a life far from the spotlight he had chosen, one shaped by perseverance and a fierce commitment to raising her daughter with integrity. The reunion didn't erase the years apart, nor did it heal everything overnight, but it planted a seed. Apologies were exchanged, not as grand gestures, but as quiet acknowledgments of pain endured and time lost. What mattered most wasn't what had been broken, but what they were willing to rebuild. And so, a new chapter began. The little girl, once invisible to the world beyond her neighborhood, was no longer alone. Her world, once limited to the radius of struggle and survival, began to expand. The man didn't swoop in to save her. He listened, learned, and showed up. He didn't try to change who she was. He honored her strengths, offered opportunities, and began creating space for her talents to grow. He brought her books on engineering, enrolled her in a community mentorship program for young inventors, and helped her get access to resources she had never dared to dream of. She wasn't a project. She was family. What began as a moment on a roadside became a ripple of transformation. He found himself returning to the places he had long abandoned emotionally. Family dinners, community events, spaces filled not with prestige, but with presence. His days shifted from tight schedules and boardroom decisions to moments filled with laughter, homework, and heartfelt conversations. The walls of his modern mansion began to feel less like a fortress and more like a home, especially when her voice echoed through its hallways, asking questions about engines, circuits, or simply telling stories from her day. In her, he saw the possibility of a legacy not built on his achievements, but on the values she embodied. She was inventive, thoughtful, and bold. She wasn't just a reflection of her mother's resilience. She was a spark of what the next generation could be when given a chance to flourish. And through her, he was beginning to rediscover a version of himself that he thought had been lost to time. Her presence softened him, reminded him that strength didn't come from control, but from compassion. That real power was found not in domination, but in the ability to lift others up. His priorities began to shift. Business decisions started reflecting more empathy. He launched a foundation in his sister's name, supporting young girls in underserved communities with access to tools, workshops, and scholarships in engineering and mechanics. It wasn't charity. It was restitution. It was acknowledgement that talent like hers existed everywhere, but too often went unseen. As months turned into a year, the bond between them grew deeper. The girl who had once crouched beside a broken-down car with oil-stained fingers now stood taller, her eyes filled with purpose. And the man who had once measured worth by bottom lines now measured it by smiles, shared meals, and the joy of simply being present. They didn't erase the past. They honored it. They didn't forget the pain. They learned from it. And from that understanding, a new family emerged. Not perfect, not without its complications, but whole in a way that neither had expected. The girls still wore the rings, but now they had added meaning. One symbolized the past, another represented resilience, and the gold vine knot ring that had once belonged to her mother now became a symbol of reunion, a reminder that even the most broken ties could be reforged with love, time, and a willingness to try again. What started with a car engine became the ignition point for something far greater, a legacy not written in contracts or awards, but in love rediscovered. And in that quiet revolution of the heart, a millionaire became something far more valuable. An uncle, a brother, a man redeemed.